We, whose names are subscribed, do, in the name of all the poor, oppressed people in England, declare unto you that call yourselves lords of manors and lords of the land. The earth was not made purposely for you to be lords of it, and we to be your slaves, servants, and beggars. But it was made to be a common livelihood to all, without respect of persons, and that your buying and selling of land and the fruits of it one to another is the cursed thing, and was brought in by war. For the power of enclosing land and owning propriety was brought into the creation by your ancestors, by the sword, who first did murder their fellow creatures, men, and after plunder or steal away their land, and left this land successively to you, their children.
Let's start with a story. Near the walls of the Kremlin, there's a small garden, and in the middle of the garden there is an obelisk, which in 1918, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, was redesigned to include a list of names, icons of the struggle for a better world. Marx and Engels are on there, obviously Bakunin is on there. The 8th name on the list is Gerald Winstanley. Winstanley was an English Protestant religious reformer, writer, and political activist, best known now as one of the founders of the True Leveller movement.
There were, we may oversimplify, two revolutions in mid-17th century England. The one which succeeded established the sacred rights of property, gave political power to the propertied, and removed all impediments to the triumph of the ideology of the men of property, the Protestant ethic. There was, however, another revolution which never happened, though from time to time it threatened. This might have established communal property, a far wider democracy in political and legal institutions, might have disestablished the state church and rejected the Protestant ethic.
There were many different movements present in those middle decades of the 1600s in England. It was a time of turmoil, a time of political and religious radicalism, and a moment of historical possibility. In 1649, Winstanley and a group of followers set up a commune of sorts at St. George's Hill in Surrey. It was an occupation of vacant common ground, which the group declared that they would cultivate, and any who wished to join them could without any cost upon them. Local landowners hated the idea and sent hired men to steal equipment and beat the farmers. After just about a year, the idea ended, the commune collapsed. It's easy to see it as religious idealism, something naive, a historical curiosity that we can look back at. At best, an experiment. But perhaps not an experiment of the past, but an experiment of and for the future. Ernst Bloch, one of the thinkers behind the whole premise of this series of conversations and essays, put forward a sweeping philosophy of history. For Bloch, the question is not where does all of this come from, but where might all of this be going? Philosophy had to be taught to hope, said Bloch, because without hope, philosophy would have no new knowledge, and what could teach it but consciousness itself? For Bloch, human consciousness has always strived towards the utopian, not just on the individual level of fantasies and daydreams, but on the cultural level and the grand totality of history itself. Bloch uses a phrase that we might translate as forward dawning, a glimmer of light, illuminating the possibility of something, what he called the novum or the new. But back to those diggers on a hill somewhere in Surrey. For Bloch, they embody a utopian urge that is universal, a desire for a world freed of capitalist exploitation and the artificial scarcities of the market. In a small way, that experiment participates in the grand historical struggle to realize what is not yet. The past is full of possibilities, of ruptures, in which we might see the ongoing effort to bring something into being, to manifest what Bloch called the not yet conscious. A dream of a better world. Not the night dream of psychoanalysis that takes one back into the mind, but the daydream, the waking dream of how the world could be, directed not towards a specific policy prescription or program or party, but the culmination of a process that Bloch called Utopia, in which humankind could, as he put it, walk upright for the very first time. Perhaps it might even seem naive, but to insist upon the utopian, as Bloch does, is to open the scope of political imagination and to make what once seemed impossible seem attainable. Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men became sort of mimetically popular on the British left, largely thanks to Mark Fisher's landmark reading of it at the beginning of his book Capitalist Realism. It resonated, that vision of a Britain where coffee shops and internment camps could happily coexist alongside one another. The disaster was not waiting down the road. It was being lived through. And post everything, it's easy to see why. It didn't show us the future, it showed us our collective present. How many times have you seen gifs of Clive Owen from the opening half of the film? You know, the bomb explosion outside the coffee shop, the staring at TVs as the news endlessly unfolds before your eyes. It became a sort of shorthand for a certain time and a certain place, a way of articulating how all of us had felt trapped, like Nigel in the Ark of the Arts.
I just don't think about it.
The better world.
I just don't think about it.
A way out of capitalism.
I just don't think about it.
The future.
I just don't think about it.
But the problem here is that perhaps that popularity made it easy to forget how the film ends. It ends with the new, an almost miraculous inbreaking of the new, and the sound of children's laughter. Even here, in the film that showed us the grim, unchanging totality of the present, the utopian possibility can never be totally foreclosed, even if not all of us will survive to see the not yet conscious be realized. Try as it might, the totality of capitalist realism is never completely final, and thus the present remains, in some senses, undetermined. Therefore, the possibility of utopia always remains, not as program or as place, but as the culmination of a process of consciousness coming to realize itself.
Reform of consciousness not through dogmas, but by analyzing the mystical consciousness that is unintelligible to itself, whether it manifests itself in a religious or a political form. It will then become evident that the world has long dreamed of possessing something of which it has only to be conscious in order to possess it in reality. It will become evident that it is not a question of drawing a great mental dividing line between past and future, but of realizing the thoughts of the past. Lastly, it will become evident that mankind is not beginning a new work, but is consciously carrying into effect its old work. We're talking about utopia today, and considering the sort of like tensions in a certain type of utopian thinking from Marxist time and into throughout the 19th and the early parts of the 20th century. And what we're, if I could speak for, the show, what we're doing here, how should we be approaching the idea of utopia and utopian thinking, considering both this passage as well as the broader Marxist literature?
Well, I think maybe it's important to begin from a kind of negativity. So utopia is not like what I really like about that Marx passage is that it suggests quite explicitly that utopia is not a place, or even a program, or a policy platform. Utopia is instead the culmination of unfolding historical processes down to the level of consciousness itself. In a way, that letter is kind of reminiscent of the opening to his the introduction to the critique on Hegel's philosophy of right, the famous point about religion, right? This idea of it being the opiate of the masses, but actually, it is the expression of a very real, existential, subjective, phenomenological problem. But the critique of the utopian socialists of Marx's day is simply that they lapse into a kind of like, in a way, is that they simply lapse into moralism. These bad things are bad because they're bad. And if anything, Marx's attitude seems to be that this is not only not philosophical or materialistically grounded, but it is a kind of denigration of the historical kind of Hegelian process of utopia itself. This
It's
constantly
reactionary,
yeah,
right?
yeah. This constantly unfolding, this unfolding spirit that is. I really love that point about history. There is no separation. There's no distinction between the past and the present. I think to think of utopia in spatial terms or in programmatic terms is inherently limiting and always runs into its own failures. Utopia is, or utopianism is an unfolding series of historical and philosophical processes experienced consciously.
A pure negative ideological critique is the problem with it's in the intentional community of utopian realization, the Shakers and that kind of a thing. It is through a recognition of that absolute negativity and it's the sort of quick reactionary pipeline that happens with this reductive view of history.
I mean, William Morris called it news from nowhere, right? Utopia is not a place.
Yeah.
And I actually think now, especially, your point about utopia or utopian thinking having a kind of negative or qualities is so profoundly important. There are echoes here of Walter Benjamin's famous line, which I just looked up. Pessimism, all along the line, absolutely. Mistrust in the fate of literature, mistrust in the fate of freedom, mistrust in the fate of European humanity, but 3 times mistrust in all reconciliation between classes, between nations, between individuals, and unlimited trust only in IG Farben and the peaceful perfecting of the Air Force. But what now? What next? And his point is not simply a kind of refusal, but it's a kind of negation of this simplistic teleological notion of history that gradually unfolds in ever greater stages of perfection, right? This idea that all of these antagonisms would be swept away by the kind of irresistible tide of history, and which divides things very neatly into the past and the present, which is in the process of overcoming it, building into a future which is overcoming our present. And no, I really love this Benjamin line of no, distrust all the way along the line. If there is to be any possibility of negating the present, of understanding the present as being something which is still under construction, as is the past and therefore the future, then it has to begin with this kind of rejection of the smooth, easy stages of kind of liberal modernity. What Fisher calls the grey horizon, which is kind of like just sliding down. And I think to understand utopia as a kind of space of negative thought is really the only way that you can do that as a Marxist, right?
The job of history is in so many ways to capture the present as a means for properly negating that same present. Just as you were saying, to diagnose the social logic is to essentially analyze latent content. I keep coming back to this point because the capability to reclaim and redeem the future. It's what's necessary is to approach issues theologically, not despite, but in light of dimensions of social logic.
I mean, I really like this term of eschatological Marxism. The kind of Marxist suspicion of utopianism is that to project into the future is really, in some way, whether implicitly or not, to reproduce the values of the present, which is why the kind of eschatological or theological aspect of Marxist utopia has to be negative, has to be negating, but at the same time, this is the negation of the negation, right? So if you have crisis, which is then normalized, you negate the normalization, and open the possibility of change and rupture. This is what Benjamin and Bloch particularly are so kind of insightful on, which is, Bloch wrote about Thomas Münzner and like radical Protestant reformers during the Reformation. The religious cry of all things in common, omnia sunt communa, whether at the time or not, is proto-communist. It is proto or preempting a kind of Marxism. I mean, this is the reason why Gerald Winstanley's name is on the monument near the Kremlin in Moscow, which lists the kind of key names of revolutionary struggle throughout history. So I think the really crucial point about kind of Bloch's utopian history or philosophy of history is this notion that events of the past their meaning is not finalized just because history has moved on. And in fact, their meaning and potential are not fully, and perhaps never will be fully, exhausted. And I think this is why utopia is kind of difficult to expunge, right? This is even now, even in the age of capitalist realism, even in the age of, the endless, omnipresent, slowly deteriorating now. It's haunted by the possibility of a utopia. It's haunted by the idea that actually, one of my favorite Fisher quotes, one of my favorite Fisher lines in it, I think it's in an interview, is he says something like, "Everyone says I'm a miserabilist. I'm not. I don't dislike change. I just wish it wasn't all shit," which I really like. It's because it doesn't foreclose the possibility of change. It doesn't foreclose this idea that the future is different, and it is. Capitalism depends upon its own negation, right? Which is the closing down of the present, the nullification, the stripping away of like libidinal or theological or cultural impulses that kind of are fracture points that can be prized open. And I think it's it's a deeply important thing to try and have this idea of a utopian vision, because otherwise what you have is no vision of what the future could be at all.
Why leave it to fascism? Fascism is the actualization of a purely negating utopian thinking that relies on imagined absolute history and biology. It's the ultimate closing off of the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually think you're making a really good point, right? Because Bloch again talks about this through the concept of non-synchronicity, this idea of the fundamentally unfinished and temporally disjointed nature of the capitalist inscription of modernity, as it were. What fascism does is, as Bloch argued, in Heritage of Our Time, which is an incredibly interesting and important book, and Bloch talks about the ways in which the various historicals and class strata of German society were offered a kind of unified totality of what history was, what the past was, and what the future was going to be, in a way that resolved all of the kind of traumas and violence of capitalist non-synchronicity. This is why there's that great line from Bertolt Brecht, right? The fascists are planning for 30,000 years ahead. You know, that the future ends, right? It is just stretched out, and any possibility of difference, any possibility of the emergence of the radically new, the novum spiritus, the new spirit, as Bloch put it, is completely expunged. This is why maintaining the space of the utopian is such an important project, right? It's not simply because we want to be naive idealists, but because in understanding the future as something that is still, in some senses, to be decided, you leave space for agency. You leave space for not just hope, but actual the exerting of and building and maintaining of class political power.
Russian Ark first begins with the disembodied voice of director Alexander Sakharov.
Открываю глаза и ничего не вижу. Помню, что случилась беда, и все стали спасаться, кто как может, так как может. Что со мной произошло?
And all of a sudden, we're surrounded by people in 18th century period costume, buzzing about as if preparing for a rehearsal of some kind. This brief introduction to the film, probably best known as the longest single-shot, uncut film of all time, the narrator raises two very important questions.
Все это разыгрывается ради меня? Или я должен сыграть какую-то роль?
Russian Ark uses thousands of actors, extras, 3 live orchestras, and its setting in the Winter Palace and Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg to bring 300 years of Russian history into a single breath. The film is imagined as a dreamlike walk through time, a conversation between the ghosts of its director and a fictionalized version of the Marquis de Kristin, a 19th century French aristocrat, diplomat, and Catholic who penned a memoir about his 1839 travels in Russia.
Ах, как русские умеют все хорошо скопировать. А почему? Потому что собственных идей нет. Ваше начальство не хочет, чтобы у вас были собственные идеи, да-да. В сущности, и ваше начальство, и все вы, ленивы, сударь, ленивы.
Ленивый.
He was less than pleased with his journey. As our small main cast travels around the Hermitage, their conversation is punctuated by various displays of Russian imperial history and European art. History and art are completely intertwined, and in between a seemingly endless series of theatrical and musical productions is an artful rendering of imperial historical events and characters. Catherine the Great observes a rehearsal in the theater that was designed for her. Peter the Great assaults a military officer. Nicholas I holds an imperial audience with Qajar Iran, and Nicholas II sits down for dinner with his family. With his variety of forms and methods, what we're witnessing here, and in many ways to the film's aesthetic credit, is as close to Wagnerian total art as it is to art film. It's an assemblage of reflections on the beauty, value, and magnificence of high culture, and ultimately, this high culture's role in fashioning a cohesive national identity. Russian Ark becomes history as rendered by its mimesis and its metaphysics. The film's creator displays extreme affection for his subjects and shows sincere belief in the flourishing affective power of nationalist high culture and the significance of Peter the Great's historical moment. In composing a passionate ode to high art as a dialogue between himself and a skeptical interlocutor, Sakharov skillfully places the experience of history at the center of his film and advocates for a particular their liberal nationalist position. Certain artistic forms are elevated by a perceived persistence of a particular national identity in their temporal and cultural discourses. The way high art makes you feel history is evident of its metaphysical significance, and thus the significance of Sokharov's imperial melancholia. He very artfully coheres history by collapsing these elevated cultural forms into one national object, one worthy of rhetorical defense, of loving, artful reconstruction, of an attempt to describe the experience of seeing it in action. Russian art closes with a 300-year celebration of the Romanovs. They're wearing this clothing, but this is supposed to be 1913. They're performing an arrangement of Mikhail Glinka's opera, A Life for the Tsar. It's a pretty striking image considering historically what came next. If I'm not mistaken, this room became an infirmary in World War I. The Bolsheviks would storm the Winter Palace several years later. And as we exit the Hermitage, we're reminded of where we are. An imperial funeral procession. We're on the Russian Ark, on the River Nova, the rendered object of history, free of struggle and pain, destined to sail forever. In September of 1827, a small crowd in Paterson, New Jersey gathered to witness a bridge installation atop the northern bank of this city's Great Falls. An important symbol of Paterson's founding as an industrial city, and of the potential role hydropower and the natural world more broadly could play in the U.S. Industrial Revolution. The falls and system of raceways developed to power the various mills and factories in the area took Paterson from a foundationally shaky economic experiment in the late 1700s into what they called Silk City. And while the installation of a small privately owned bridge above a waterfall is by all accounts a pretty mundane event, for the bridge's owner and his supporters, it represented the next chapter in the ever-unfolding history of this town. Their personal relationship and anxieties regarding change in technology and the Industrial Revolution, and even their contribution to new forms of cultural expression. Timothy Crane purchased the forested land behind the Great Falls to construct not just a bridge, but to aesthetically overhaul the property and especially to install a pleasure garden. He cared about his high cultural bona fides, and these projects seemed to be a way to prove himself while opening up new streams of revenue. The more rhapsodic of Crane's supporters would go on to describe Forest Garden, very creative title, as evidence of the sublimity of nature, as a brilliant scene of science, and Crane himself swelled with pride at the mere thought of it. This garden and its bridge, which he designed himself, were to be representations of refinement, upwardly mobile bourgeois cultural values. So when a 20-year-old called Sam Patch, a mule spinner from the Hamilton Mills cotton factory nearby, disrupted the bridge laying with a leap from atop the falls and into the water below, stealing the newspaper headlines through a playful act of minor vandalism, a single moment became marked by its historical excess and refracted brilliance. Crane's predominantly working-class neighbors had used the falls and its surrounding property as a place of leisure before he purchased the land and began militantly charging tolls for his bridge and, honest truth, enforcing strict good manners policies. Sam's jump was in many ways the boiling over of a long simmering conflict between Timothy Crane and the workers and industrial competition in his community. This Patterson jump would be the first press clipping of the daredevil Sam Patch, and the beginning of his meteoric rise to ultra-early celebrity status in the early 19th century, thanks especially to Paul Johnson's masterful biography of Sam Patch. We know the man sometimes called the Jersey Jumper, who drew enormous crowds with increasingly unhinged and eventually fatal stunt leaps from waterfalls, who inspired both cautionary and folktale, both plays and fiction alike, was actually from Massachusetts. That Sam learned how to leap into bodies of water from high up when he lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where he was employed in a mill as a child. He was around 7 or 8. That he had a childhood marked with financial loss and instability, with the actions of his alcoholic father, who would later abandon his family, coloring everything around him. And from such an early age, the formative experiences that made him Sam Patch were directly mediated by the familiar tensions between labor and leisure time. For Sam and child laborers like him, falls jumping defined the identity along familiar lines of hand workers in the century before them who described their craft as art. It critiqued emerging refined artistic sensibilities, and it inspired local antagonisms that fell along class lines that would continue to expand and knot into tension and rupture into outright conflict. And it was an artful expression of intersubjective experience, a kind of moment that reminds us how an object of history as rendered by the experiences and struggles of ordinary people causes a single moment to overflow with meaning and toward new possibility. A reminder that leisure games of child laborers can make history, and when they leapt from the cliffs toward the water below, they shined in the sun, reflecting back onto the falls that powered the industrial towns where they lived, into the mills where they knotted threads and cleaned the floor, into the corners of those mills where they'd sometimes sleep, and outward, far and wide, for all to see.
Eagleton says this: alternative universes are really devices for embarrassing the present, as imaginary cultures are used to estrange and unsettle our own. As such, they have largely been the product of the left. The finest of all such works in Britain is the Marxist William Morris's News from Nowhere, one of the very few utopian visions to offer a detailed account of how the political transformation actually came about. Meanwhile, a hard-nosed anti-utopian right has scoffed at the unreality of such proposals, rather like the Daily Mail on the new Labour leader written here about Jeremy Corbyn. The word utopia means nowhere, but it isn't clear whether this is because the place could exist but happens not to, or whether it is nowhere in much the same sense that a humble Richard Dawkins or a coy Chris Evans is. I guess the kind of question to ask is the left currently, in this way that we talked about in the first half, is the left currently utopian? Or has it kind of ceded the ground of like utopia in favor of a sort of like hard-nosed realism, this idea of like looking, the kind of ruthless criticism of all that exists, to use, the Marxist phrase. Post 68, post the collapse of like the 90s protest movements against globalization, post 2008, post Occupy, does the utopian still have that kind of same place, or has that all been traded or kind of downplayed in return for this kind of often very somber, very, very kind of like, I suppose, hard-nosed look, trying to be as unsparing in our assessment of the present as possible?
I think it's a struggle, at the very least.
I think so. I agree, actually. I think there is the potential of missing the dialectical imperative of optimism and pessimism, right? We're caught between both wanting to engage in that ruthless criticism of all that exists, because not only is that necessary, but is the negation of the present is the only capacity in which we can build the future. But that also depends upon seeing within the present various kind of potentialities or possibilities that have positive content, And to be honest, the thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this before we started recording, about the ways in which are there utopian aspects. And like we made a video not so long ago about riots, masses, crowds, and riots, and the idea of these kind of uprisings, these mass movements of people having a utopian content, I actually think is super important, because it allows for an understanding of people being able to make history not in conditions of their own choosing, but also raises the possibility of making the future. To me, the symbol of this was in the UK with the statue of what's his name, Edward Colston, the slave trader, whose statue had been put up in the center of the city for years. It is a negation of the present state of things, but in that negation, there's a kind of joyful affirmation of what could be possible, of what might the future look like.
I think this is why history is so important, to create new forms of meaning.
You've talked about this. It's never just a singular object which has a singular objective truth content that can be discerned and placed within an appropriate taxonomic categorization of history, right? It's even anything that is involved with, I suppose, human potential has a kind of excess, a kind of capacity for meaning that is never ultimately determined by even what the object is intended for, right?
Yeah, this is what like a statue of an asshole on public display functions as, and why even a minor defacement is useful for a productive understanding of this particular object, formed and shaped by its present, the digestion of its particular context, I guess.
And this is why those kind of moments, or even those objects, are so important to hang on to, not because we want to, hypostasize them into like relics, but because they are imaginative, they're catalytic imaginatively, right? And I think if there is one thing that is kind of lacking, not necessarily in the political, but in the cultural sphere, is a sense of that utopian possibility in culture. What I think a lot of writing, a lot of like mainstream literature at the moment anyway, is very much about an almost exhaustive phenomenology of the present, right? A kind of exhaustive and exhausting. Horror and speculative fiction have always done really interesting things historically, but I think like speculative fiction about the future tends to lapse into dystopia rather than trying to, and which is going to get easier than ever, right? That's going to become easier than ever is to produce dystopias, which even in their negative sense, right? Even if you look at them, even by their absence, there's a utopian element to them. But this is why I think both of us really liked Carl Neville's book Eminent Domain, which is this. As I put it on Twitter, it's a book that's trying to kind of wrestle with the question of what if we won? What if the better world actually arrived? What if we projected outwards from moments of potential and possibility within the present and pushed those to their ultimate conclusion to see what that might look like?
There's a lesson in form in Carl's modernism, neo-modern sort of assemblage. It's written as a series of entries, essentially. It's written in such a way to where individual experience is placed in conversation with a more radical form of imagination. Radical is particularly in its pessimism, the potential for experience, or the description of experience. And when we think about how is it useful?
Yes, and I think it doesn't present a kind of totalized vision. It doesn't give you a kind of view of totality, but cumulatively, through the individual consciousness and through a multiplicity of those consciousness interacting, you get a sense of how totality would be experienced from the point of view of the individual subject, right? And I think that's what makes it such. I thought like it's a super compelling bit of utopian fiction, and it shows that the utopian processes are still open-ended, right? You know, you have what is the role of murder investigation in the People's Republic, in a society that's genuinely committed to socialist ideals. I think that deliberately polyphonous, formal artistic choice, that very modernist choice, is the grounds upon which contemporary utopianism still has to kind of salvage itself. You know, Fisher called it popular modernism. This idea that actually mass culture is not simply the imposition of false consciousness, but is actually an opportunity to engage with an alter consciousness on the level of the masses. And I think this is something that we both really enjoyed, precisely because it shows the sort of flip side of left-wing melancholia, right? Even that left-wing melancholia has its place, right? Because as Benjamin points out, that puts a tremendous opportunity and responsibility into the hands of the present. You know, thesis on the philosophy of history. History is an act of redeeming the dead, right? Not just understanding the fact that they lost, but actually redeeming the fact that they lost in the construction of a future. Is the opportunity of understanding history this way with a properly kind of critical utopian idea. And is also the responsibility of, not just the responsibility of kind of Marxism towards the future, but Marxism towards its own history, revolution towards its own history. I think it's an incredibly painful thing to think that the idea of the utopian might vanish entirely.
The deepest fulfillment of our wishes is to be real and practical. Mm-hmm. The desire to reach a sense of self at the end of a bottleneck. It's not sufficient to neglect the potential for latent content, as we can so clearly see the way that the social world so efficiently homogenizes, flattens, and communicates with itself and affirms its own reducible language of representation to make itself real. But the problem is that there's stuff outside of this to sort of remove a layer, if you will, so that we may awaken within our dream state and begin to explore an actual one-for-one representation. The problem is that there are worlds above worlds, above worlds, above worlds, where we live in our current sort of like cultural imaginary. Mm-hmm. And that to be radical is to imagine a perfectly reducible self, the irreducible infinite self, messianic, if you will, reproduction of their own particular values and beliefs and goals. Yeah, if your goals and your beliefs are shitty, it'll affirm your shitty goals and beliefs, but sometimes it allows people to imagine a world without slavery. It's now possible to think differently.
There's a China Miéville essay in Salvage magazine, which I know we both read and both really like, which says, is it better to hope or to despair? And the answer is yes. It is better to hope or despair. And without utopianism, what you get is left-wing melancholia, miserabilism, the unending, exhaustive, unstoppable impulse to constantly critique. And what's needed is both. What's needed is both what Bloch called the spirit of utopia, but married to the critical understanding that utopia is made now. To discard utopia is to trap ourselves, both imaginatively, culturally, and most importantly, politically, on the terrain of our enemy, as it were, right? On this kind of capitalist psychogeography from which there is no way out, because it will condition everything down to the level of thought itself. But taking that awareness of the contingency and fragility of our own thought, even, but understanding that history provides so many resources for rekindling the spirit of utopia, the utopian impulse that is this unfolding process, is precisely the ground of hope, right? How do we have hope without the utopian?